We are a nationwide organization of elders working on climate change, both dealing with what's happening now and also trying to make sure that there's a livable, desirable world for our children, our grandchildren, and all of life. So we do a lot of things related to that, and we're very pleased this afternoon to bring you this workshop with Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray. I'd like to remind you this is going to be a little longer than our usual national call. It's going to be an hour and a half. We'll start with a brief introduction, and then Dr. Ray will do a presentation. After that, we'll have some Q&A with Dr. Ray, and then Margot Frank is going to lead us in a discussion activity. Our main presenter, Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray, is chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt in Arcata, California, which is on Wyote territory. Motivated by the despair she began observing in her students about a decade ago, Ray's work focuses on the role of emotions in climate justice advocacy and the relationship between inner resilience and collective action for climate justice. Her book on this topic, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, was written to be an existential toolkit for the climate generation. Her writing on emotions and climate justice activism has been published in the LA Times, Scientific American, the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, Edge Effects, KCET, and the Zocalo Public Square. She consults extensively on the topic of climate anxiety, is working on an edited book, which will be called an existential toolkit for climate justice educators. She also offers a professional development workshop to help others center emotions in climate work, has the Climate Wisdom Lab, and has begun teaching a mindfulness course on transforming climate anxiety. That's a lot of information, so we will put links to her work in the chat, but also you'll get them tomorrow in a follow-up email. I'd also like to introduce Margot Frank. Margot was part of the ECA National Leadership Team from 2015 to the end of last year. She's a licensed clinical social worker and lives in a small rural community a few hours south of Dr. Ray and works with older adults. Her community's been impacted by drought and wildfires, and her client's anxiety can be easily triggered during fire season. Margot was also trained in somatic resilience and regulation work and in the community resiliency model. She believes strongly in climate activism as an antidote to climate despair. So now let's pass it over to Dr. Ray.
Thank you so much, Francis. And thanks so much. I got to meet Margot, who lives right down the road, and I just drove through Ukiah, so I'm pretty excited about that. I wanted to just thank also Ariana for scheduling all the work, all the Google Docs and the emails and the whole thing that goes on the back end to make these things happen. And Jen for making sure that this could happen with you all. So thank you so much for inviting me to share with you all today. I came to this work, as was mentioned in Francis's description. I came to this work and thinking about what role emotions have in sustaining climate advocacy through my students. So I was working on environmental justice issues, and I come to environmental studies as a discipline through the humanities. Actually, my bachelor's degree is in religious studies and women's studies, and I have a master's in American studies. So I was really interested in cultural studies more than anything. And I was driven by questions like, what's real? What makes people have meaning in life? You know, those kinds of questions, just small stuff like that. And I came to environmental studies through those lenses. I didn't come through the sciences, which is often the case. And I didn't come to the environmental studies field through, you know, some sort of childhood love of nature like many people do. And I do really genuinely have acquired such a thing as a result of my studies. But it's been a really different kind of a journey than most folks. But as a result, I think it gives me a particular set of lenses to think about the kinds of questions like, what is the role of emotions in climate justice advocacy? And it's absolutely fascinating. I'll dive into that very question in a moment here. But I do want to just point out the fact that, as many of you know, one of the things that's very interesting and fun for me about joining a group called Elders Climate Action is that the concern around climate change is highest, remarkably higher. I mean, the data is really in on this, the younger you are. So wonderful to see all your faces. And also, isn't it wonderful that so many of you care, and you are just a small fraction compared to how much youth care about this? So this is a real opportunity or real door into one of those many sources of my optimism about what we have to look forward to here. Young people care, at 3 to 4 times the rate as older people, and it just spread. There's a direct spread depending on your age that is inversely related to concern over climate the younger you go. This is actually demographically, it's even more interesting. The generational difference is not even the most interesting story about this, although that's a major focus of my own research. And I wrote my book for young people thinking, oh, the data is really clear about young people really caring, and they really need some help. They don't have a lot of the practices and inner wisdom that comes with age that they really will need to do the climate work that they are doing, that they're on the precipice of doing, if not doing already. And that was really where my book came in. What can we give them an inoculation of what it sometimes takes to be in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s to figure out about, facing mortality, impermanence, the preciousness of life on the planet. What do you do in the face of terrible news over and over and over again? What is resilience in the long term? All of these kinds of questions sometimes take some life experience to acquire if you're not getting it from your direct elders. And I think the vast majority of American youth are not getting that from their elders, and there's a real opportunity there for intergenerational and intragenerational wisdom translation. That said, the most interesting data on demographics is that young people and young women in particular of color are the most concerned about climate change. And so if you really want to dial down on demographics and concern about climate change, there's some really interesting stories to reveal there. And I just wanted to point out that as a result of, there's all kinds of interesting discussions happening that I won't get into today, but I'm happy to talk about in Q&A about how to leverage the generational differences on climate change. What are the kind of climate communication strategies around different age groups and different demographics? What different values within these demographics, are most likely to care about to get them to budge on climate action, all that kind of thing. And it turns out there's some really interesting research on elders climate action. You probably are familiar with this and talk about this all the time as a group, but that talking about an ethical commitment to one's grandchildren is and actually the emotion of guilt, which is an emotion I'll actually reject for the majority of my talk, but the emotion of guilt by a younger generation directed at older generations has shown to be one of the most effective emotional strategies for climate action. In general, I actually have a whole chapter in my book on rejecting guilt as an emotion for climate action and environmental action, but I find it interesting that the one place that it really does work is around intergenerational climate communication. So just thought I'd throw some of those interesting details at you, and was happy to talk about some more of that in Q&A. I'm going to get started on screen share here and dive really into this talk here. So that's just the title. That's the title slide. If you want to check, if you want to note the email and the Twitter, I'm happy to be in touch with folks. I won't have this at the end of my slide, so it's super easy. sarah.ray@humboldt.edu. If you're interested in contacting me and want to follow up on anything or have a question that we don't have time to answer today. But just a quick outline. Why are emotions really important to climate justice work, education, activism, anything related to our really, why are emotions key to anything that we do in our life is really what the research is helping me explore in terms of climate activism. Then I'll talk a little bit about my book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, and just a really quick argument for why inner practices, what happens inside of ourselves, is actually essential for collective action, essential for social movements, and certainly essential for climate action at even the upper levels. And I'll be using language even from the IPCC that talks about inner transition that's required for thinking about large scale climate work, which is a counterintuitive argument, right? Because we think about what's happening inside myself as small and not large scale. In fact, many of us may not even feel like it's worthwhile, as an impactful action. But I want to make the case that in fact it is. Even the IPCC says it is. That's the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. They put out a report every year on the science on and what their best practices and recommendations are for dealing with climate change at a global level. Then I want to take a look at just kind of dive into each one of my chapters in my book is a strategy I propose. And one of the strategies is called Hack the Story, one chapter. And I just want to kind of do a little short deep dive into that one so you get a little bit of a taste of what I'm talking about in the book. And I want to end on breakthrough inquiries that maybe Margot may or may not want to use as a touch point as you move into the workshop portion of today. These breakthrough inquiries, I put these ideas in quote marks, the inner transition and the leverage point, because this is language that I'll explicate through my talk and maybe internal jargon to the world of climate resilience. But the inner transition is the language that often is used in, like I said, it's been used in the IPCC and is now being used in circles of climate and mindfulness and all kinds of transformational resilience spaces, all these spaces that are talking about how do we leverage inner resources to do the kind of work we need to be doing. And the leverage point idea is, of course, Donella Meadows, a famous economist who talked about leverage points for change. And so I wanted to sort of throw those ideas out there, that those are words I will be talking about. I won't expect you to know them, but that's sort of the argument that I want to get to. And then, of course, hopefully sometime, as Ariana beautifully did in our agenda for today, create some time for questions and discussion. Okay, so this first outline point, why do emotions matter? Some of you might be familiar with a lot of the really interesting psychology research that's coming out more and more sort of by the day, by the year, on how human beings make decisions, proceed in life, change their mind, change their behavior, retain knowledge in a classroom or in any kind of learning setting, how they decide what kinds of actions are the most ethical or responsible, and I have that hyphen there on purpose, based on emotions, not reason. So this is a counterintuitive notion as well. For the most part, if you're like me and you were sort of raised in a kind of colonial, post-Cartesian, post-Enlightenment mindset, you think that facts and data and reason drive human behavior and will ultimately move human society along this arc of progress towards justice. But it turns out that, in fact, this is not true. And research after research after research is showing that human beings overwhelmingly make decisions and do all, make the world that they live in based on emotions rather than reason. And so this is research I won't go into all the details of, but it's absolutely fascinating. You can certainly look this up. Another reason that emotions matter, and this is for all of our behavior, but certainly around climate, right? That the science of emotions shows us that different emotions, such as joy, pleasure, desire, anger, grief, guilt, right? These are just sort of the basic emotion wheel that we might be familiar with if we've ever been to a, social emotional learning workshop for our kids or grandkids, which they're now doing in schools, which is amazing, or if we're even familiar at all with different types of emotions from some sort of psychotherapeutic or clinical setting, that these different types of emotions shape climate action in really different ways. And so we should really try to be strategic about this. In general, for example, guilt is not a very effective emotion to leverage long-term climate action, but for certain demographics, it really is, right? So some emotions in general, in gross terms, can be very effective, and we ought to, try to, create messages that use them. Think about our audience and deploy these kinds of messages with these kinds of emotions and the science of emotions in mind, because for the very reason of the first point, right? Thirdly, the suppression of so-called negative or uncomfortable emotions that we often dysregulate us, such as grief or anger, often just fuels the problem more. And so we often see this in terms of grief studies, that the suppression of grief or the not facing of the discomfort, not turning towards the painful emotions actually is a situation that fuels the problem more. And many people are arguing that the reason why we're in this climate problem or predicament in the first place is because human beings are incapable in general of dealing with the shock and fear and anxiety that the loss of our ecosystem services would inspire for all of us. In fact, this is one of the reasons why people say denial is just a elegant cognitive solution to the size and scale of the difficulty of facing this problem of climate change. And so denial is not solving the problem. And if we continue to deny or suppress all the discomfort that would entail to face these things and face the gravity of it, it just makes the problem worse. And I don't know about you all, but I also, when I don't like this news that I'm consuming about the environment or anything else for that matter, I tend to engage in actions that, if I'm really honest about it, do more harm to the environment and to other people. So just as an example. And fourth, our mental and physical health affects our ability to engage in climate justice. And so this is sort of thinking about inner resilience as a climate technology, which I will get to in a moment. But I love thinking about what is our inner resilience, our resolve, our stamina, our ability to do meaningful work despite setbacks, our ability to own and take stock of our own privilege and how that operates in the world in harmful ways, and do our best to diminish that. All of the stuff that might inner work is actually really essential. Emotions, I think this is just a super fascinating point. Let's just look at the example of fear, right? We know, you don't have to have me tell you that fear does all kinds of awful things, right? It triggers fight, flight, or freeze reflexes, and it triggers a sympathetic nervous system. Thinking about here now about the neuroscience of this, that some psychologists will call amygdala hijack, or Dan Siegel, with his notion of the window of tolerance, which I'll talk about in a moment, talks about in terms of dysregulation. And so fear is a really good political tool to get people to surrender their sort of prefrontal cortex and rational thinking in order for people empowered to do what they want to do. Right? Fear also allows us to bypass abstract thought that might be required to respond ethically in service of longer term goals and values. It makes us think about just getting rid of the fire that's right in front of us, and not whether or not that's the action taken to do so would be consistent with our larger value system or our longer term goals. And we know that algorithms and social media explicitly proliferate content with fear and other negative emotions. And so when we realize that fear, in fact, serves, we start to realize that my individual fear really does serve a larger system of capitalist exploitation and power consolidation. All of a sudden, I start to realize that my fear is, in fact, very, very political and important. Of course, it motivates action. One of the reasons why people use fear in the climate sphere is to get people moving, right? Let's use fear to get people to be really worried about what climate's going to do to them and to their loved ones, and that will trigger, hopefully, action. Of course, there's a lot of research coming out on this, just talking about the limitations of that assumption. But it does, in fact, motivate action, especially in the short term. There is research on that. And it makes people more likely to surrender their civic power to a state or military authority. These are some of the bad things that fear can do for us, right? And we see that. I'm sorry about this slide. I need to fix that. But moving on to the next slide, we see also that fear has some positive effects. There's all kinds of, I mentioned just a lot of interesting research that just came out, this research on the role of climate fear to climate action. There's some people are really studying this stuff and finding, metrics, ways to study it, ways to prove it in sort of a, statistically significant way. But we also see how it might, on the other hand, lead to, and this is a workshop I was part of, or a webinar I was part of, and I'm doing some work with Jade Sasser and Blanche Verley to think about the intersection of big emotions like environmental fear or fear around climate anxiety and things like eco fascism and the rise of white supremacist violence in the examples of things like the Buffalo shootings, this notion of the great replacement theory, and the kind of climate undertones of all of this kind of these forms of violence. So fear you can see how fear can really leverage all kinds of action, not necessarily actions that always reduce harm, sometimes not quite to the contrary. So just an example, how can we use fear as an emotion to leverage the kinds of climate action that we want to be seeing, especially when we're thinking about justice as a central part of our work in climate change. So what does this mean for the climate? Well, this is where I started to think about, okay, what if all of this is true, if these 4 points about why emotions matter are true, what is it that we need to do? And this is where the book comes in, me trying to answer this question. We know all this stuff about emotions. What does this mean for climate education, climate action? Because my students don't know this information. I was never taught this information. As a professor, I was given a PhD with a lot of cerebral, heady information and told to walk into a classroom and just dispense this information to unfeeling, talking heads with their heads above the desks at the, in the classroom. And if they have any emotional reaction or response, they can go to counseling and psychology services. Their emotions don't belong in the classroom where learning is happening, right? So this was a real assumption that I brought as an educator into my teaching. And it certainly is an assumption I see, really, really pernicious assumption that I see in much climate spaces, in large part because climate spaces, climate action spaces have been really driven by the sciences. And the sciences are the worst culprits on thinking that emotions don't have a place in political efficacy around any particular topic. And that I know is some fighting words, and we can certainly pick that up, and I'll be glad to talk about that in Q&A. So the table of contents of my book are here: Embrace Life in the Anthropocene, Getting Schooled on the Role of Emotions and Climate Justice Work, which I just kind of gave you a little bit of a smattering of that. Cultivating Climate Wisdom, Claiming Your Calling, and Scaling Your Action. And this very much has to do with, this chapter is my students' favorite chapter, because in this chapter, I'm talking about the problem of climate change feels so big and you feel really small. So how do we scale all these things so that we can stay engaged for the long haul? And then the 5th chapter is Hack the Story. And of course, I'll get into that in a minute. The 6th chapter has to do with the kind of communication dilemmas that we see around climate change and thinking about culture wars and tribalism, this sort of, and also cancel culture, all the stuff that we're seeing around critical race theory and canceling climate conversations in certain states and legislatures. This chapter is an attempt to try to deal with what's going on there with the argument to be less right and more in relation. And that has to do not just with each other and people across the political aisles, but also with the more than human world. Chapter 7, Ditching Guilt, Moving Beyond Hope and Laughing More, explores some of the maybe less likely, less attended to emotions in climate spaces. When we think about the environmental movement, a lot of negative emotions come up: eco grief, climate anxiety, guilt, all these types of emotions we don't often talk about. Humor or pleasure, and even hope is one that I do want to sort of put a pin in and be more nuanced about. And finally, second to last chapter, Resisting Burnout. Burnout is a particularly dangerous problem within the climate activist space, and I don't know how that lands on you all, but when I talk to young people, this is one of the most important chapters for them. They really are feeling burnout. This ties directly into the chapter on cultivating climate wisdom, as I mentioned earlier, that maybe older generations could give them some advice about, having lived through many difficult times. And then finally, Feed What You Want to Grow. I'm drawing here very much on neuroscience and also wisdom traditions, and specifically on the work of a scholar activist named Adrienne Marie Brown, whose work I very much informs much of this, and where she talks about in her book, Feed What You Want to Grow, instead of focusing on all of the things that we fear. So just to dive in, as I said, I promised I would do at this part of the talk, to dive into this one chapter on hacking the story. So why does the story that we live in matter? And you probably are thinking, yeah, of course it matters. What's she going to say here that I haven't thought about? But I want to kind of dial in and detail about why this might be true. And I open up with this picture, this image of the Pacific Islander climate activists. This was during I believe, I want to say this happened during the last, this was during the Glasgow COP last year, I believe. Somebody can, maybe it was the one before, gosh, whatever, moving on. But this image was taken in their activism around the rising sea levels that was causing them to lose their land and housing and communities and of course ways of life and culture and everything else. And the point about, you know, the argument about stay alive 1.5, this notion that we can tolerate a certain amount of sea level rise at a certain amount of change in degree of temperature of the planet, is that in itself, this notion of 1.5 is in itself a story, right? It is a story that has certain types of things built into it as inevitable ways that things are going to unfold, and certain things that we're trying to avoid, certain types of culprits, certain types of protagonists, antagonists, and a particular arc to the story. And of course, what you have here is the Pacific Islanders trying to intervene in the story, trying to say that story is not inevitable. We are not going to inevitably drown with that story, because that's not how we're going down, right? We are in fact going to rewrite the story. From our perspective, we are fighting and we are not accepting the inevitability of that story. So I want to just a little bit note that there's a story implicit in all of our climate news and information, even when it's couched as facts or as sort of in these political, really technological or political spaces. They're all stories that we can choose to participate in or not. I really want to focus here and really stand on the shoulders as I speak about the idea of stories with Joanna Macy's work. If you're not familiar with her, she's responsible for creating this concept of the work that reconnects, which is a whole paradigm of workshops around climate resilience and the inner work required for climate action, or just ecological and social justice, not even specifically climate. Joanna Macy is a eco-Buddhist social activist that's been around for a long time. And one of her messages in the work that reconnects in all of her books is this concept of the stories of now. And she writes in the books and talks about the ideas of stories of now, presents 3 stories, and I'll just present 2 to you today, and asks people to think about what happens when they live in these different stories and how living in these different stories affects their ability to engage in long-term social justice activism or environmental activism or whatever, or even just the ability to wake up in the morning, okay? So Joanna Macy's got one version of the story she calls the Great Unraveling. And in the Great Unraveling, she describes it here that much attention, our attention, to go back to feed what you want to grow. Where is our attention? We can talk, I mean, I could give a whole talk on just attention. But anyway, attention, drawing attention to disasters. This story is about ongoing derangement and collapse of biological, economic, political, all the systems just all collapsing. The climate itself is unraveling. We're experiencing the sixth great extinction of species. We've got something out of Revelation here: hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, and wildfires, all amplified by global warming, leaving people without any access to things. Whole systems are being destroyed. We've got military operations, conflicts, famine, drought, staggering refugees, systemic racism, enmities, leading ultimately to just massive, unequivocal human suffering. And this is the story of the Great Unraveling. And I don't know about you, but as I listen to it, even though I've given this talk a few times, I feel my own heart rate increase. I can feel myself moving into fear. I can feel my amygdala getting hijacked, and I feel myself wanting to maybe just go online and buy some more shoes or something. I don't know, right? I mean, you can see how the living in the story of the Great Unraveling is a really, really, really dysregulating story to be living in. If you are yourself familiar with the story because of the news you consume, and you maybe feel like this is truth, then you really do know how this feels. And you might have done some research, or you might be familiar with the research on doom scrolling, and of course, the negativity bias in the news. But this really feels like the reality of the world that we live in to most people, and certainly to my students. To suggest that this is just a story and this is not the only reality out there is almost anathema to most of my students. And they think I've gone wacky, you know, when I suggest that this is just one story, which is what I'm going to do. I'm getting there. So what are some key elements of this story of the Great Unraveling? Well, one of them is inevitability, right? To go back to the Pacific Islanders argument that this is not inevitable. Hello, inevitability doesn't help us, right? And I want to draw attention to a recent Statesman article by Rebecca Solnit that's very, very effective at unpacking this argument about inevitability in the story of climate collapse, that I would just note and put out to you to go look up yourself. But inevitability is a very, very dangerous element to a story. Of course, there's decline. And there are many people who talk about stories of decline. You might be familiar with the notion of Make America Great Again. That is a story of decline. There's an inevitable story that it was once great and it's gotten bad, right? And we need to make it great again. Climate change has a very similar story. Environmentalists have been using a very similar story. The environment was once awesome. For whatever reason, maybe colonial contact, maybe industrialization, Cartesian thought, all kinds of people have locate different things as the source of the problem. That's very debated, hotly debated. But at some point, decline is happening and things are going to hell in a handbasket. So decline is part of this story. Also, an aspect of scale is very critical here. The scale of effects is global, systemic, and larger than anyone can control or influence. And of course, we think about Timothy Morton's concept of the hyperobject here, that he talks about climate change as a hyperobject. And what he means by that is that it's so dispersed across space and time that it's almost impossible to get your hands around it, right? If we had a problem that we could kind of get our hands around and fix, that would be one thing. But climate change is presented as so big as to not be almost touchable, right? Too big to fix in a way. There's no specificity of actors doing the harm in the story, right? There's like, it's just this horrible, inevitable, train wreck that's happening, and we don't know who's behind the driver's seat of this thing. And there's a real pessimistic view of humanity and human nature, right? That you're going to get red in tooth and claw real quick. And there's also no evidence of progress or pathways for solutions. So it's utterly not nuanced. There's no suggestion that people are in fact building solutions as this plane seems to be crashing. And the intended emotional effects of this, of course, are fear, anxiety, resignation, apathy, and you may have a few more that you would list. Glenn Albrecht, the Australian philosopher, has all kinds of really great terms to talk about this. Solastalgia, global dread, you name it, look him up and look up. His new lexicon for environmental emotions would give a lot more granularity than I'm offering here. But okay, so those are the key elements of the story. So what does the story do to our capacity to respond? Well, let's look at this from kind of a neuroscientific, neuroimmunological perspective. Yes, a lot of words, and it's an actual word, and I had to learn it when I did this research, psychoneuroimmunological, which is sort of like saying mind and body relate to each other, and the neurological stuff that happens in your brains around thoughts has actual effects on your mind and body, which, seems obvious, right? Wasn't obvious to me. I had to learn it in the last 5 years. Okay, so what does the story do to our capacity to respond? And this chart here is, you don't have to look at all the words on it, but I'll describe it kind of briefly. The range of resilience in the green zone here, when we feel that we are in our range of resilience, Dan Siegel would call this the window of tolerance. Range of resilience is more of a trauma-informed set of words to describe a very similar thing. When we're in our optimal arousal zone, we can think about our long-term picture. We can do all the prefrontal cortex stuff. We can think about our values. We can, postpone having the marshmallow in our mouth now so that we can have two later, right? They talk about all these higher cognitive functioning that happens when we're emotionally regulated, okay? And when we get triggered out of our emotional regulated, when we get knocked out of our window of tolerance, we either go into hyperarousal or hypoarousal. In any case, different people in different situations do both of these things. You probably have already experienced both of these things already today. One has to do with kind of being fight or flight, right? Hyperarousal, and one kind of is shut down, psychic numbing, and sort of wanting to numb out. We're all familiar with this, right? So this is what the story of the Great Unraveling often, I don't know about you, but it puts me into both of these triggered spots of dysregulation pretty quickly, even with my knowledge about how destructive it is, right? So becoming more aware of what the story we live in is doing to our minds and, of course, our bodies, right? I mean, we know that the mind-body split is not what we think it is, similar to the way emotions run things, not logic. These dualisms are all not really what we may have, I at least was brought and raised to think that they are. And I won't go into these details of here, but of course, those of you who are familiar with the role of stress, chronic or acute stress, the effects of it on our immune systems, our organs, our various bodily functions, knows that this is not a clear division between our mental and physical health. So this is a way of saying, okay, so what does it all have to do with the climate? Okay, so One of my colleagues who I work with for the Climate Wisdom Lab created this graph. I find this really supremely helpful to describe this. People often talk about climate change is going to have mental health impacts, right? Climate change is going to affect mental health, but people don't often talk about how mental health and physical health is a necessary resource for people collectively and individually to address climate change. The sort of other side of that feedback loop gets completely missed off. And I want to bring up this chart to say, hey, if that's happening to your range of resilience, and if you're getting dysregulated and you have chronic and acute stress, it is diminishing your mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical capacity to do the work needed to mitigate climate change. And this is a critical problem. That was what alarmed me about my students when they started to try to drop off the edge of the cliff. So this chart kind of helps us see that better. On the left, we see that climate disruption in the middle kicks off a cycle of reactivity, which then increases structural stress in our families, workplaces, institutions, organizations, which decreases those institutions' ability to mitigate climate change, which thereby, as you can imagine, increases climate disruption, which is why you see that orange triangle expanding on the left there. The opposite is also true, hopefully, right? And this is what Joanna Macy's trying to do. This is what a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is trying to advocate for. Climate disruption maybe kicks off a kind of revolution in thought, right? What Donella Meadows would call the most important leverage point in the system, which is to change mindsets so that our structures change, and those structures change in a way to increase climate mitigation and thereby increase fix climate problems, right? So you can see that there's a cycle here that's more important than we probably give most attention to. A 22-year-old put the same chart in her own words much better than I can. She says, depression tells us that we are at once powerless and culpable, and therefore the only logical response is to disengage, inward, eschew connection, a response which only serves to reinforce the oppressive systems like racial injustice and capitalism that are truly responsible for our suffering in the first place. So just to translate that a little bit, in the terms of that chart I just showed, what she is saying is that these systems deliberately cause us to be dysregulated, deliberately intend us through their algorithms that we see on media, for example, to be in a state of amygdala hijack, deliberately cause acute and chronic stress and trauma. And that stuff makes us turn inward, eschew connection, and that can thereby increase the very systems in the first place. If in fact the medicine and the cure for the problems of social and climate problems is connection and building collective activism, then this particular set of cycles is really dangerous. You can see that a 22-year-old has figured this out just by her own experience with despair. So what is pseudo and efficacy, and where am I going with this? So one of the things, this is in response to that question, what does the story of the Great Unraveling do to us? Pseudo and efficacy is the biggest answer I can offer for that. Paul Slovic and Scott Slovic in his book Numbers and Nerves are two of the most frontline thinkers on this stuff. This is an edited volume, but in this I learned about this concept of pseudo and efficacy, which climate psychologists are studying and have a lot to say about. The idea of pseudo and efficacy is that is the idea that people are less likely to offer help if they think that the problem is too big for them to solve. The positive feeling of solving any small part of a problem is outweighed by the negative feeling of not solving the whole. And so this goes to this point I made earlier about Timothy Morton's notion that when the problem of climate change is portrayed as so big as the great unraveling of all these systems, everything is going to hell in a handbasket. We feel not even like we can even begin to carve a corner out of one part of the problem. We're going to give up entirely because we can't solve the whole problem. So pseudo-efficacy is a very important psychological tendency that happens when a problem is represented as too big for us to fix. And this is often talked about as a drop in the bucket imaginary. And this combines with this concept of negativity bias, which you're probably more familiar with, that makes us subconsciously give more significance to negative things than positive things, and this affects our behavior. And so, for example, Rick Hansen, the neuroscientist, talks about the brain is like Teflon for positive information and news and feedback, and it's like Velcro for the negative. And this, of course, fuels what media will provide us. So we think we're consuming truth and facts and stories about the world in the media we consume, but the media is part of capitalism too, and it has to rely on demand and eyeballs and attention for its income, right? It's basic market logic. And so it will produce the stuff that gets it the most money, which is based on our negativity bias, really, really bad news of the great unraveling. So we see once again a kind of a feedback loop happening here. So what is happening? We've got negativity bias. Our risk perception is very, very heightened, leads us to live in a story of the great unraveling, which then is reinforced by media. This leads us to feeling pseudo inefficacious, and also sometimes for some people leads to psychic numbing and empathic distress, depending on the kind of person you are, which leads, of course, to inaction and a self-fulfilling prophecy. What I mean by a self-fulfilling prophecy is that if we believe we live in a story of the great unraveling, based on what the psychology says, we are likely to do things and act in ways that will bring that on even faster. Alternatively, Joanna Macy talks about the Great Turning as a different alternative story. If we lived in a great story of the Great Turning, we would feel very differently about waking up in the morning, she argues. We hear of the Great Turning as a transition from industrial growth society, from attitude shifting from exploitation to respect. We have people coming to realize that we're interwoven as peoples. We recognize that we have solidarity with one another, which is the opposite of what Morgan Florsheim was talking about there, the 22-year-old that was worried about that. And so we act together for the sake of life on Earth. And she talks about, she goes into great detail about the 3 prongs of the Great Turning. You're welcome to look it up. It's all available online. But some examples of the Great Turning story that we see in art, expressions of art more than anywhere else, are, for example, something that really happened and it peaked really during COVID, I found, that there was a lot of people trying to say, hey, this is an opportunity for us to get rid of the wool of our eyes about the normal that we're living in and think about maybe we're on the precipice of a great turning here. And for example, we see on this mural, this sort of invitation to participate in a great turning. We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalize greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, and extraction. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. So again, we see this invitation. What if all this horrible, horrible stuff that's happening is an opportunity to stitch a new garment? Similarly, Valerie Carr, on the eve of the 2016 US presidential election, wrote a poem called The Sick Prayer for America, in which she says, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? And again, we see this in poetry, Afrofuturism, speculative fiction, solar punk, all kinds of places that are more artistic, where there's an invitation to imagine the great turning. Just as an example, you might remember that behind my key elements of the great unraveling slide, I had this warming stripes image. The warming stripes image, of course, is a story, and it is a story of the great unraveling, as you can imagine, right? We see things were good before, and look over here on the red, things are going terribly wrong. But there's no sense of agency. There's no positive story that seems inevitable. There's decline. All of those elements of the great unraveling are built into the warming stripes image, which I am otherwise a big fan of, and I'm happy to wear my warming stripes socks or whatever it is I get for Christmas this year. I'm sure it'll be awesome. But the implicit story that just as an example of changing the story ever so slightly, if you put these few words over the warming stripes image, you slightly change the story and offer an invitation to a great turning opportunity. What is the difference that we feel when we see this image with the opportunities for improvement built into the image versus the warming stripes just by itself without any overlay of text? That's just an example I'm trying to give you of how the story we live in and the warming stripes really shuts down action, makes us feel pseudo inefficacious, really makes us want to just shockingly numb out and check out. Whereas a story that has an opportunity for us to rise to the occasion and take action to change the fate of the future has us living in a very different existential emotional place. So the key elements here: the future is ours to make. Progress is possible. A movement of helpers exists. And yes, I'm referring to Mr. Rogers' mom's expression there. Awareness of the collective diminishes individualism and alienation. What I do matters. Specific people and extractive systems are to blame. It's not everything. It's very specific. But this stuff is not going to make the news because negativity bias means that any great turning story is not going to sell. The intended emotional effects are hope, efficacy, empowerment, solidarity, pleasure, joy, and I'm sure you can think of many others, right? So you can see the essential, that the planet really needs us to live in a great turning story, is the punchline here. So why is the inner transition a leverage point to change the system? This iceberg image exemplifies Donella Meadows' idea of the leverage points and to change the system concept that she has coined. She talks about how it is that on the surface, we see events all happening. We see George Floyd get murdered. We see the Water is Life protests. We see what's happening in the Amazon. We see all these different things, but it's not until we go deeper and deeper do we see patterns of behavior between these events and even a systems theory analysis of what's connected between these things. And social justice movements are really, really good at systems theory. And even beneath that, we recognize that what's happening in the heart and the mind, the mental models, the values, assumptions, and beliefs that shape the system, if we look at that place as the most important leverage point in the system, that makes us come to the conclusion that the inner work is really necessary. And Paul Hawken puts it even more beautifully than I could. He writes, the most complex radical climate technology on Earth is the human heart and mind, not a solar panel. What if we invested in the human heart and mind as much as we invest in other technologies, or considered them a technology for climate? Okay, I'm going to wrap up now with my skill and breakthrough inquiries and some just final slides just of happy, awesome stuff. A skill that we need for the climate that is an inner transition skill is building capacity in the mind and body for long-term engagement. So how do we do this? Maybe asking ourselves some breakthrough inquiries can open up some new doors for us to walk through and change the way we see our relationship to the problem. What would it take to see yourself as efficacious? How might you cultivate a mindset and practices of resilience, engagement, and relationship? What would need to change in your life? What would change in your life if you saw your well-being as the front lines of climate advocacy? Another skill, mindfulness of our emotions, so we know how to be our most skillful selves and expand that resilience zone. So how do we do this? Let's focus on what our distress points to. Maybe even think about how capitalism is operating through us. And can we become more aware of the stories that we live in based on what I just described in the hack the story part of the talk? More critical connection, less critical mass. Those are Adrienne Maree Brown's words. In my words, it's be less right and more relation. How do we do this? Community trust and collaboration are the medicine for both social and ecological ailments. So what would our work look like if we valued relationships more than all the other outcomes we ostensibly are, here to produce? Hacking the story and paying attention to our attention. I talked about that already. I won't go into that anymore. Heal the world with a radical imagination. This is where a real cracking question from Adrienne Maree Brown's book, Emergent Strategy, changed the way I do everything, where she said, what would it take to imagine thriving in a climate change future? And so I reframe this in other ways. What do we desire even about the future? Can we focus less on the stuff that needs to change and more on the stuff that we want to grow? That's to me, that's a breakthrough inquiry question that I ask myself every day because it's not intuitive. Resisting urgency. How does urgency hijack our minds and hearts and prevent us from acting wisely in service of that which we love the most? And this is really true for young people. The older I talk to people, the urgency problem is not as much of a big deal. And just a few quotes that I love, and I'll end. Audre Lorde's beautiful quote, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is a self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Robin Wall Kimmerer from Braiding Sweetgrass, even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, ours is not the task of fixing the entire world at once, but of stretching out to mend the part that is within our reach. That's very much in line with that pseudo-efficacy point. The beautiful new book out by Tricia Hersey called Rest is Resistance. Tricia Hersey writes, rest is a form of resistance because it disrupts and pushes back against capitalism and white supremacy. Bayo Kamalafe, also another counterintuitive argument for activism. The times are urgent, we must slow down. And my favorite, of course, by Ada Remy Brown, got to end on her. We have to make justice the most pleasurable experience humans can have. And I will end there and say thank you. All of the things that I'm up to were talked about in the introduction. So I will assume that that will all be shared out and stop screen share. And thank you. Francis, you are muted.
The most common comment on Zoom, you are muted. Dr. Ray, thank you for reminding me of that, and thank you for a great presentation. We have a few minutes for Q&A. We may not get to all the questions, but please put your questions in chat. We'll do as many as we can. One question from early in your presentation is, what is eco-fascism?
Great. Eco-fascism, it's one of those Wikipedia things you can look up too, but the idea that people are so worried about climate or the environment that they particularly scapegoat a particular population as the source of the problem and think that the government's not going to do enough to address them and take matters into their own hands. And so there's a real eco-fascist movement among white supremacists that is very prominent right now. And some people often say, oh, it's just a fringe movement. It's just fringe. The eco-fascists are just fringe. It's not fringe. It's very, very alive and well. We often think about the climate as being a progressive left issue in the political sphere. It's a Democrat issue, but on the far, far, far right, climate change is also very much of concern. And a lot of people are using the frenzy around climate change to try to actually recruit more members to their ranks. And of course, it's the manifesto that the El Paso shooter used in 2019 was called The Inconvenient Truth. And the manifesto for the Christchurch, it was riffing off of that. And also the Great Replacement Theory are all based on this notion that climate change is going to drive these demographic shifts that are going to threaten white supremacy. And so something has to happen to stop that.
Very important point. Another question, if you're in the negative, more depressive stage, can getting involved in a group like Elders Climate Action help you to change your outlook and become more resilient and effective?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting science here, and I'm just going to say, yes, obviously, right? But the science on this is actually kind of interesting. Research is showing that when people get involved in community, whether it's virtual, physical, all of it, and all of it's got this effect. That community is the medicine that solves both the climate problem and our inner despair. So there's that's fascinating. And what's also fascinating is that the thing that actually makes people feel better is not the solving of the climate problem that they think is the source of their problem. It's the community connection and feeling they're part of something larger, right? Because if you look at human needs, if you look at, lots of places you can look up human needs and what the sort of hierarchy of needs are. The need of human beings to feel like they're part of something larger is and feel like that their life has meaning, that they have some control of the conditions of their life. Those things are actually what is easing for people's climate anxiety when they join groups. It's actually not necessarily the requirement that the group is actually solving the problem that you think you have. I could go on about that, but that's just fascinating. Yeah.
Oh, great. One of our participants said that one of the most compelling ideas they found in your book is the idea of abundance. And would you talk more about how to shift the story toward abundance?
Oh, thanks for bringing that up. I don't use that because it's a little bit difficult to explain that one. So this is very much an Ada Remy Brown idea too. I really want to cite her heavily just because I don't want to appropriate her ideas without acknowledging them. But the idea of abundance is in contradiction to the sort of logic and discourse of scarcity that's so implicit in so much environmental discourse, which is that there's not enough activism, there's not enough political will, there's not enough resources, there's not enough money on the planet to fix all these problems. This sort of sense of doom and gloom is based on this kind of notion of scarcity of resources to fight the problem, or scarcity also of the good things, right? Like we don't live in a story of great turning because we have a scarcity mindset. We don't see the good things happening out there. So all of the abundance stuff is implicit in a lot of things I already said. Like if we focus on that which we want to grow, that's like if you looked around your life and didn't see deficit, but you saw abundance, what would that take, right? What would it take to not see all the lack in your life? Oh, I got to go buy something to fill that hole, right? So abundance, it has manifestations in lots of spaces, collectively as a movement, individually for our spiritual lives, our consumerism. There's all kinds of ways to think about that, even thinking about abundance of resources, plenty enough to share so that we don't have to go and, reject refugees, right? I mean, there's all kinds of places that an abundance orientation moves climate action away from damaging, harmful action towards, solidarity and mutual liberation.
We have several questions about climate action on different scales. And we can take action locally, regionally, nationally, globally. What are your thoughts about those different scales of action?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think the scale of the problem, going back to my point about pseudo-efficacy, usually daunts most people, especially young people, because they perceive themselves, we're told by capitalism that we have no power. So there's that. So the scale is not just about the problem being represented at such a huge scale. It's also about us being represented as having no power, being too small. So there are things we can do to change the way we see ourselves in scale, which is another Adrienne Brown argument. She has this whole concept of the fractal. I'll just put it out there. And there's also this idea of changing the way we frame climate as a problem. I think it's critical that we frame climate as a problem that's small in scale, i.e. local, and that we frame our scale as much bigger than we think it is, because that is actually only serving the people in power to not have us fight this problem, for us to perceive ourselves as powerless. So the scale thing is critical on that level. And also I fundamentally believe that the only way that we actually can leverage our power as individuals in collectives is at local scales. And if we do that at a great turning level, this is happening already. Paul Hawken calls it the blessed unrest. The blessed unrest has been going for a long time. We're just, it's not like, if we think about it in terms of abundance, it's there, it's been there, and it's doing great stuff, and it's successful. And so, thinking about ourselves in collective changes our sense of powerlessness and smallness of scale. But the places that we can do the most action on climate is at the local scale. I think that's the spirit of the question. Yeah.
Okay. And someone was asking about community grants for local climate action. Are there any opportunities you've heard about that? Oh
gosh, yeah. This is not my wheelhouse, so I have to say I can't help for that, but I wonder if Margot knows the answer to that question. She probably does. And I'd say it depends on the county, right? I mean, depends on where the seats of resources are. Some counties are really hopped up on trying to support initiatives. And, it's just a matter of doing the research and figuring it out. Who else is doing it around you, and where are they getting their money? And can you actually collaborate with other people who are already doing this work to build, to scale out that work rather than inventing it from scratch? They probably know where those funding sources are. It's probably very county to county.
And the question about some people, get involved in climate action because of sort of a fear response, and then maybe start to feel better if something seems to change. So does that lead people to, fight again, or how would, do you think there's any role for that?
For what? I'm sorry. I couldn't.
Well, I'll read you the question. I'm not sure I'm getting it right. Okay. If we respond to fear with fight or flight, and then a result in reducing climate change takes away our fear and makes us feel good, so we fight again.
Oh, so there's a cycle of maybe like complacency, kind of what you feel like it's saying, Francis? Okay.
So.
Yeah. So the research on this does not suggest that to be true. The research on this actually suggests that the sense of eudaimonia, or whatever you want to call it, pleasure, those are the emotions. But you can also talk about perceived emotional synchrony. There's all kinds of words to talk about what happens to us psychologically when we participate in collectives, okay, whether it's in person or not. That thing itself is the dopamine hit that is actually more long-term addictive than the dopamine hit of fear that we are scratching when we just go and do some action, right? Some people are saying, hey, your climate anxiety is not just a one-way ticket to action. Action is not the antidote. Action can be what the guy in El Paso did, right? I mean, action, we gotta be, you have to do some thinking about what kind of actions are the most effective and not just react, right? Be reactive. And so that's where being in our resilience zone and taking the urgency knob down a few and really thinking about what are the actions that would be the most effective to do what I care the most about, and doing that not out of an urgency reactive space is very, very critical. So yeah, I would say that the research on that shows that pleasure and collectivity make people stay engaged in action much longer than fear. So there's that research, and also fear does not necessarily always drive the kinds of actions we want.
Yeah, great point. So we could probably talk about this for hours, but I know we can't do that. So thank you very, very much for being with us this afternoon. And we'll have lots of information available for people, including other ways that they might encounter Dr. Ray's work. And I want to turn this over now to, thank you. I want to turn it over now to Margot to lead our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I just really resonated with all you were saying, and that was great. And I would just want to mention that Mary Pfeiffer wrote a book a number of years ago about her activism around the Keystone Pipeline, where she lives in Nebraska, called The Green Book. And at the end of it, that book, she says, as this book is going to print, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but in a way it doesn't matter, because what happened from our coming together, cowboys, Native Americans, all kinds of people across the political spectrum to work on this, was that we built community, and that will carry us through whatever lies ahead. So in this moment, before you go into your breakout rooms, just take a moment and look at whoever else is on the screen in your gallery view. And remember that we are all, there's over 90 people right now on the call. And so all of us are working together as a collective to change things. You're not alone in this. So we're going to send you off into some small breakout rooms for, I don't know, about 10 minutes or so, probably. And in that breakout room, it's an opportunity for you to remember not to get caught up in what you think is right, or just in your factual thinking brain. We're going to ask you to engage with the question of what are the ways that you keep yourself from being stuck in the story of the great unraveling. How do you attend to your emotions so that you're able to engage in climate action, basically. So making sure that everyone in your group who wants to speak has a chance to speak, and that no one person dominates. You're part of a community in your small group. And then we'll come back together again, and you'll have a chance to share some with the larger group for those of you who'd like to do that. And I think that I will send you off with that, and enjoy your conversations. And in the chat is also the question that you'll be engaging with in case you don't remember by the time you get there. Well, welcome back, everyone. We hope you enjoyed your conversations in your small groups. You will be seen in the chat. Jen just now dropped a link to our Mentimeter. And if you click on that, you can type in just a few words, a word, a phrase that of something that is an answer that you had to the question of what are the ways that you keep yourself from being stuck in the story of the great unraveling? How do you attend to your emotions to help you not get stuck there? And then we'll share some of those. And this way we get to learn from one another through our whole big group.
Margot, you should be able to see some of those.
Yeah.
popping up from
So
the screen.
yeah, they're starting to pop up, and I will share some of these. Gardening both makes me feel better and is also a mini solution to the problem. Being in community, expressing gratitude to and for nature, staying in touch with other activists and learners. I grieve when I feel it, honor it, tell somebody, and then get out into nature where I re-experience that Gaia is much bigger than humanity. A lot of people talk about being in nature. Intimacy and connecting with other humans on any level. Bird watching is an absolute must. Being a climate activist, but also allocating time to other activities that help me to disengage, like painting. Having a virtual community of other climate activists. ECA is great for building that. A grandmother's group that made a quilt based on Joanna Macy and Paul Hawkins' concepts of regeneration. Beautiful to use art in that way. Connecting with the local Green Party and its members. So I'm seeing that, you know, people talk about, here's writing to voters in Georgia, taking some direct action. Climate, whoops, let's see. Climate aware psychotherapy practice at evucation.com. Getting out and getting my hands dirty, planting trees in my community. So many of these most of these have to do with doing things with other people, whether it's virtually or in person, and connecting with the natural world as ways that help you to not get stuck in that negative spin of the great unraveling, which, you know, we live in a society that, as Sarah said, really encourages that. And ECA is clearly a place where you can create that community virtually. If you have a chapter, you can connect with your chapter virtually or maybe in person now. And with other groups in your community. I want to encourage you to, or suggest that you might want to, if you have your video off, you might want to turn it back on and put your hands on the edge of your little video screen so that you're touching hands with the people whose little videos are right next to yours, and you can feel through the energy, through the waves here, the internet waves of your connection to one another, that you're not alone in your despair and you're not alone in your commitment to taking action. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Ariana, or whoever is finishing up here. Francis, you're muted. Yes, you did it.
Thank you, Margot. So definitely wanted to give a huge thank you both to Dr. Ray and to Margot for all their help in leading today's workshop. That's been terrific. Wanted to make sure that that you all also are aware of some upcoming events. On December 6th, December 8th, our next event, renowned chef Chris Galarza is going to teach us about induction cooking and other ways that we can have great meals without needing to cook with fossil fuels. Then on January 5th, we'll be having an event in conversation with authors that will be with Madeline Ostrander and Bill McKibben. And please watch your email for follow-up to this, and also for more information about events. You can also go to the Elders Climate Action website to register for those events. And last but not least, if you like this program, we'd like to ask you to please consider donating to ECA. It's only through your donations that we can put together programming like this, and we certainly want to continue. So thank you all very, very much for coming, and we hope to see you at future events and other ECA activities.